Alrighty, welcome to lesson 3.2. We're going to talk about relations between angles. So I've got a picture over here. These two angles are what we call adjacent. What adjacent is just a fancy word for beside each other. Okay? Now, in order for angles to be adjacent, they have to share a vertex and they have to share an arm. Okay? As you can see, these two angles here, they share their vertex and they both use this arm right here. All right. So just to make sure that you understand this, I want to show you some examples that are not adjacent. These are not the ones I'm going to draw. All right, so for example, if I have an angle like, or if I have two angles like this, an angle here and an angle here, you can see they share an arm, but they have different vertexes here and here. So that's not adjacent. I could have two angles like this. They share a vertex, but they don't share an arm. So those are not adjacent. And finally, if I have two angles that are just chilling like this, they have nothing in common, they're just there. They're not sharing a vertex or an arm, so these are not adjacent. Okay. All right, moving on. So, whenever you have an intersection, some real cool stuff happens. Okay, so whenever you have an intersection, I have room to write that somewhere. Intersection. And that's just a fancy word for when two lines cross. You have some fancy stuff. So as you can see, I have a bunch of angles. Just so it gets less confusing, I'm going to call this one A, B, C, and D. All right. I'm not going to measure it because, well, if you watch my last video, you see I have difficulties with the protractor. Um, let's just, I don't know, let's assume that angle B is 75 degrees. All right. So we know that a straight angle adds up to 180 degrees. So this angle here has to add up to 180 degrees. Therefore, A plus B has to equal 180 degrees. And, well, looky there. I've got another straight angle right here, if you look at two of them. Well, D plus A, that has to equal 180 degrees. And if I want to get real fancy, I'm going to run out of room here, so I'm just going to write up here. Another one here. D plus C has to equal 180 degrees. And lastly, C plus B has to equal 180 degrees. These are all degrees. So that's kind of cool. So knowing that, we can actually figure out what angle A equals. So I know, if as long as you know one angle, you can figure out all of them. So I know that 75 plus whatever angle A is has to equal 180. To get A by itself, I'm going to subtract 75 from both sides. I'm just going to have A equals 180 minus 75, give you 105 degrees. So this is actually 105 degrees. And I could do that again to figure out what angle D is. To figure out what angle D is, I'm just going to scribble down here for now. Angle D plus 105 has to equal 180. Subtract 105 from both sides. And I'm just going to have D equals 75 degrees. Now you'll notice that we're starting to get a pattern. And if I went to do this again, I would find that angle C equals 105 degrees. So something cool happens when you have an intersection. Adjacent angles are always adding up to 180. Now you'll notice the angles across from each other, the ones that aren't adjacent, we call those the opposite angles. So in this case, it'll be B and D and A and C. You'll notice they're equal. A equals C and D equals B. And that'll always happen when you have an intersection. All right, and I'll write that better on the next slide here. So we have a fancy word for two angles that add up to 180, to 180 degrees, or a straight angle. We call those supplementary. I hope I'm spelling this right. Supplementary. Supplementary angles. Those are ones that add up to 180. Two angles that add up to 90, those are called complementary angles. Complementary. All right, so as we saw on the last slide, when two lines cross, adjacent angles are supplementary. Adjacent angles add up to 180. And opposite angles are always equal. So whenever you have two lines crossing, if you know one angle, you can figure them all out, as we're going to do in the next example here. All right, two straight paths cross at 30 degrees shown. Find the measures of the other three angles. All right, so we know that these two angles are opposite. So right off the bat, you can say that A equals 30 degrees. If they're opposite, they are equal. Now let's go B and 30. These guys here are adjacent, so they need to add up to 180. So B plus 30 equals 180 degrees. Subtract 30 from both sides. I'm just going to have B equals 150 degrees. If you don't trust me, you can toss that into a calculator. So I got B equals 150. So this is 150, this is 30. And hey, B and C, those are opposite angles. So C has to equal 150 degrees as well. Wham, bam, done. Moving on. All right, let's get a little bit more complex. A little bit. So W-type roof truss is the most common type of truss in simple wood frame construction. The two angles will depend on the roof's pitch. If the pitch of the roof is 32 degrees, calculate the values of X and Y. So the pitch, as you can see, is kind of the angle at the bottom and the top of the roof. So to figure out angles X and Y, we got to do a little bit of, you guessed it, math. So first thing you have to remember is that all the angles in a triangle add up to 180. So that means 32 plus 32 plus whatever X is has to equal 180. So 32 plus 32, that's 64, plus X has to equal 180. Now to get X by itself, I'm going to undo that addition, I have to subtract 64. Whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. Those cancel out, and I just have X equals 180 minus 64 should give us number 180 minus 64, 116 degrees. So that's what X is. Now, you saw that I extended this line here, and you can see, if you just look at this part here, I've got two lines crossing. X and Y, they are adjacent angles. Adjacent angles have to add up to 180. 116 plus Y has to equal 180. Subtract 116 from both sides. And I'm going to have Y equals 180 minus 116 is 64 degrees. So those are my answers right there. Cool. Alrighty. So using this, you're going to try these self-check questions. Remember, ask me if you have questions and have fun.